Thanks a lot. When I write nonfiction, I basically start with the single premise that events never happen in a vacuum. Anything is a result of many past actions, where different people grew up, what they thought, how they mixed together, who they met. There's no one simple answer to anything. So when I do write these books, I try to pick an era in American history. When I wrote about Bonnie and Clyde, I was really writing about the Depression and growing up poor in the Dust Bowl. When I wrote about the gunfight at the OK Corral, which was not actually a gunfight and wasn't at the OK Corral, but the accidental shooting on in an empty lot on Fremont Street just didn't have that same sort of ring to it when the first people were going to write this history. I wanted to write about the settling of the last part of the American frontier. And about 3.5 years ago, it occurred to me that a lot of that unique period in American history that we know as the late 60s is either getting completely forgotten, or else people are sort of putting their own little twist on it. Oh, yeah. Some people say, well, it was the hippies with a lot of sex and drugs, and, wasn't that silly and cute? Other people remember the passion over the war, the students marching in the streets. Other people remember the space age with the Cold War still going on. Tom Hayden said, when I interviewed him for this book, that he doesn't think there's ever been a couple of years in American history where we were bombarded almost every day with an event that just almost seemed impossible to comprehend. We had assassinations of beloved leaders, or at least controversial leaders that would live in history. We had a war that was dividing the country. There was more racial violence in America than there had ever been since Reconstruction, and worse in many different ways. Yet it was also a time when there was great literature being written, great music was being composed. The Mets won the World Series, which for those of a certain age will understand this was about as miraculous as things could get. And then there was the great day that a man first walked on the moon. On that day, when that happened, at Spahn Ranch, the women of the Manson family were doing what they always did every day. Charles Manson had told the women that their role, as dictated by the Bible, as dictated by the Beatles, as dictated by him, was that they must be subservient to men at all times. And so all the women in the family every afternoon were required to form a sewing circle and mend things, because that's what women were supposed to do. And so they're sitting there sewing. Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel, the woman who was known as Squeaky, Sandy Good, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, names you've heard before in other contexts. And they're all sewing. And one of them says, do you know what? I heard there was a man on the moon today. And the other women started laughing at her. And these folks who followed a man who preached that he was perhaps the second coming of Jesus Christ, that there was an apocalyptic race war about to erupt where the blacks would annihilate the whites. The Manson family during the war would hide in a bottomless pit in the Mojave Desert where, as they hid, they could change into any pretty little being they wanted to, including fairies or elves. That when the war would be over and the black race would stand alone, they would not be able to govern themselves, so the Manson family would come out of the hole in the desert and rule the world. These women who believed that, when one of them had the nerve to claim that a man was walking on the moon, they laughed and said, oh, come on. Somebody is making that up. And the 3 years I've worked on this book, I don't think I heard an anecdote from anybody that quite captured the Manson family's buying in to what they were hearing from their leader, and as he ordered them, blocking out the outside world, where he told them it wasn't safe, that if they ventured into it without him, they'd never last. It wasn't my intention to write a book about Charles Manson when I decided to write about the late 1960s. As I always do, I made a list of people or events that I thought would be interesting for me to know more about. And I thought at first I might write a book about the Weathermen. I think you folks might remember them. In that era, in any given week of 1969 or 1970, according to government records, there averaged just over 40 domestic terrorist bombings in this country. That's every week. We have seen in recent years terrible attacks on our country from outsiders. In 1969, in 1970, the attacks were coming from ourselves. But when I started to look at that, I thought, there just aren't specific individuals I want to build this around. It's such a complex sort of thing. In trying to capture all the different main players, we might lose the thread of the story. So what else is there? Then I thought I'd write about the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Again, all of you are too young to remember this. I remember being in college, and the campus SDS faction would want a meeting, and they'd talk about overthrowing the government, and that we had to stand up, we had to bring the war back to America. And I was in college, being able to pay my way by working in Kmart, and because my father, a retired Air Force sergeant, had a little bit of pension coming from the government that made the difference whether I was in college or not. I didn't want the government overthrown then, even if I didn't agree with everything. But Tom Hayden's written about that, and Mark Rudd, Bill Ayers, whether we agree with them or not, they've told their story. I think they've told it pretty completely. So what's left? And so I tried to ask myself, who is one person from the 1969-70, that time in American history, whose name would be recognizable not just to folks our age, but people who are younger, maybe even people who are still in college. And of course, there is one answer to that. And that left me to do two things with this book I was going to write. After reading the other books about Charles Manson, and as I believe you may know, there have been many. If you wanted to collect each one of them, my last count was, by reputable publishers, since 1975, there have been 171 books about Charles Manson. If you throw in the self-published books, and to this day, I'm sure many of you realize he has active followers who are publishing their books on the internet. All these things have been written, but I never found a book that was the one I wanted to write. The definitive Manson book, written by Vincent Bugliosi and Curt Gentry, is of course called Helter Skelter. It has so far sold 8.4 million copies. My book is breaking in its first week in print. It's going to be the New York Times bestseller list, number 13, which means I am only 8.3999 million behind Bugliosi. But if you folks are in a good mood tonight and you have a lot of friends you want to get gifts for, maybe you can move me up in the rankings a little. I hope so. Bugliosi, who was so generous and kind and helpful to me in the writing of this book, I can't stress his generosity enough, and Curt Gentry told the story pretty much of the arrest of the Manson family and the trial that followed. And they did it brilliantly. I wanted to write a book that did two different things. First of all, I wanted to find out how Charles Manson became the person he was in 1968 and 1969 and 70. All we ever had to go on, and what's been accepted by everybody, is what Manson himself wants to tell people.